Dakotania Cheta Dute Makiapido, Kai Pachichuya Ian McKay Makiapido, Kantewa Shea Nefitch Uzapido, Breo Kantuan Dakota Hemakido. What I said was, hello, my relatives. I greet each and every one of you with a good heart and a handshake. My name is Chetan Duta, which translates to Red Hot. My government name is Ian McKay, but I go by Chetan. So if you see me, call me Chetan. I'm a Spirit Lake, Dakota, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you to this event. Thank you very much for coming. I am the president of NATO, and we co-sponsored this event with Mofu, which is Matt's organization. We'll get to him. And I'm really excited to see Chef Sherman and his excellent work. I am a fan of food. I hope you are too. I'd also like to just acknowledge that we are on Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Ojibwe land. So prior to European settlement, this is First Nations land, and it still is today. And I'd like to thank University of Wisconsin-Stout for giving us this space to work with and providing us with the funds we need to make this happen. With that, I'll pass it off to Matt. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chetan. So as you said, my name is Matt Segura. I work in the School of Hospitality Leadership here at UW-Stout, and I also am the faculty advisor for Slow Food. Slow Food, to boil it down very simply, is about good, clean, and fair food. So good for us, clean for the environment, and finally fair for the person who grew it, that they're also getting an adequate wage for the product that they grew as well. So I just wanted to stop and give a very big thank you to all those who played a part in the event today, starting of course with NATO and the Native American Student Organization, also the Multicultural Student Service. Where is Barb? Let's give Barb a round of applause here. Our own social organization as well, and then I have to especially thank the chefs Adam and Alistair who are upstairs, who are providing or making the tea and the food samples that you'll be enjoying after the event today as well. So just want to give them a shout out. And then of course the School of Hospitality Leadership played a small part as well in ensuring the success of our event by providing us, as Chetan said, this space today as well. So we're very happy to see a full room here today for the message that Sean Sherman is to share. In my own master's thesis, I tried to define a Midwestern food, and I boiled it down to 3 I's: Indigenous, immigrant, and industrialized. To really look at the full history of it, and sometimes we very much often look over that first I, which is Indigenous. And so I'm very excited to welcome Sean Sherman here to listen as well. So Sean is coming to us originally from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and he has spent 30 years cooking in U.S. and Mexico, and also he is the owner of food truck?
Tatanka Truck.
Tatanka Truck in Minneapolis area as well. And also he has started his project, Sous Chef, in 2014 to really bring about the message, again, of Indigenous food, revitalize what is the Indigenous food. And finally, he has written a cookbook, which I own myself. I hope you've gotten a chance to purchase and get signed as well today. That cookbook, which is the Sous Chef Indigenous Kitchen, has gone to win awards just last year in the LA Times, so it's been praised as the best book of the year, and also the Smithsonian. And of course, Sean continues to work with the Sous Chef Project, a team of 12 people who all played a part in today's event as well, to make Indigenous food accessible to as many and all communities as we can. So please join me in welcoming Chef Sean Sherman to the stage.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Can you guys hear me okay in the background there? You're fine? Okay. Great. So my name's Sean. I am originally from South Dakota. I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm a member of the Ogallala Lakota Sioux tribe. Both my parents grew up on the reservation, and my grandparents also grew up there too. My grandparents were the first generation of kids that were really kind of from going through the boarding school systems and stuff like that. My great-grandfather's generation was the generation that really saw the Lakota, what happened to them getting pushed on to Pine Ridge and things like that. So my great-grandfather was 18 during the Battle of Little Bighorn on the Lakota side, and then his generation really saw like everything kind of come down really fast for the Lakota. So what I'm going to do today is really talk about kind of the philosophy that we utilized, a lot of the knowledge, how we kind of came about it, how we think about indigenous foods, and just kind of go from there. So there's quite a bit to talk about. So I'm going to start there, and at the end of the talk, we're going to do a quick little demo, and there's going to be some food samples for everybody after that. And then if there's any questions, we'll be able to open it up for a few questions at the very end. So first off, where I like to start with everything is just here, is just knowing that no matter where you are in North America, there's indigenous history, there's indigenous culture, there's life and history that starts well before Laura Ingalls, despite our high school book teachings. So first off, it's just thinking about that situation, that there's a lot out there that we've kind of ignored for a long time. To the point where we are today is just like, where are the Native American restaurants? Like, why are there very few, if any, Native restaurants out there at all? And why isn't this something that should be more? It should be more. Like, we should see Native American restaurants everywhere. Because again, like, no matter where we are, we're standing on indigenous land. So it just makes sense. And oh, I see. Oh, it's like it's a delay. I just have to like wait up for myself. Yeah. All right, is what it is. But part of it was this kind of, I had this epiphany moment because all of a sudden I realized I'd been a chef in the Minneapolis area for a few years. And then I realized that I could get food from all over the world just walking around uptown, in a neighborhood in Minneapolis. And then there was like no representation of the people or the land or the food or the flavors or the history right where we were standing. But it was so easy to access food from all over the world. So it just seemed really silly. And it's like that right now. Because wouldn't it be great if you could drive across the country and visit Native American restaurants along the way and see how much culture and diversity that we have right here in North America? Instead of just like the same hamburger and same Coca-Cola all across the board. So for me, it was just as a chef, it was kind of exciting to start to think about that, and I wanted to try to figure it out. So when I started doing it, I started reading a lot. It was kind of like I couldn't, there wasn't like a main resource to go to. I couldn't just go online and order Joy of Native American Cooking, to like figure it all out. I had to really dig in deep. So I started looking in many different areas. I started reading lots of historical context. I started reading lots of first contact pieces, which are very skewed because they're usually military or religious perspective, never on the indigenous perspective. And then I started looking at, I started learning the foods. I knew there was a deep connection with wild foods. I started spending a lot of time reading ethnobotanical books, which would be very dry information, but valuable information. But a lot of times it would just say something like, Native Americans used this plant for food and medicine. Europeans made wine out of this plant. And that would be like the context of what was in those books. So it was really just getting outside and connecting with the plants was a big part of it. But then just really understanding the history is, so like, why are there not Native American restaurants out there? And we've gotten this question asked a lot to us because they're like, wow, what you're doing is so cool. I never even thought about that. Why aren't there more Native American restaurants? It just would seem so simple. Like, why hasn't anybody done this? And there has been people who have tried here and there. There are some restaurants out there here and there around the country, but we wanted to do something different. We wanted to focus on showcasing foods that went beyond before Europeans came in, before European influence. We just wanted to see, like, what can we do with that knowledge and that mindset. So to understand like why there aren't Native American restaurants, first off, it's just understanding this piece is, what is colonialism? Because it's a really important factor to where we are today. And you really have to understand what colonialism means, because we use terms like pre-colonial, decolonize, those kinds of things. So it's really important to know. So the easiest way to really understand colonialism, Google, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So we see this happen in world history a lot. We see that happen all across the world, all around Africa, Southeast Asia, India, New Zealand, Australia, Hawaii, all the Americas. And they're opening up what they call these trade routes, but they're not really trade routes because they're taking everything from these other regions. They're moving around goods, resources, peoples. Europe becomes really rich in a really short time period in human history because of this kind of situation. But it's really important to think about because they were just really kind of like calling the world, like, I get this section, I get this section, But you have to understand that, how this affected everywhere, basically. And it's a really important part for Native American history to understand where we are, especially with indigenous foods today, and especially with American colonialism, which is a really important thing to think about because after America becomes solidified as it is, as the United States of America, when it's a very young country, at that point in time, they had very little control across. So this map shows everything in blue is an indigenous control. Even though Spain says they own part of it, France says they own part of it, the U.S. government takes claim to parts of it, it's still under entire indigenous control in almost all those areas out there. Lewis and Clark haven't even spread out at that point in time. So it's just getting to think about how recent this history happens for Native Americans. So there's going to be a time lapse that'll show you like how fast between 1800 basically and 1900 of how the westward push happens across America. And almost all the land really falls during the years of like 1840 to 1870. And during this time period, people are being dislocated, relocated, completely killed off in general. There's all sorts of disruption happening across the board. And it's a really tumultuous time period for indigenous peoples. It hits the East Coast very heavily first. But again, like I said, around 1840, it shoots across the board. And they basically just take over so fast. So 1850 is not ancient history. So there's no reason that when we see Native American artifacts in museums and things, they shouldn't be treated like ancient history because I was just studying the food of my great-grandfather's generation was all. It doesn't go back that far. And this is what's left today. Like these are the reservation systems. So by 1900, all of that was basically taken away from the indigenous peoples and they were pushed aside. So that's a really important piece to understand because one of the main ways that they did this to start to subdue indigenous peoples was a war on food. And it starts in the East Coast directly because, control the food and control the people, and the U.S. government found it easier to subdue a nation by destroying their food. So on the East Coast, they destroyed all the crops first, and they destroyed all the supplies that they had. And then when you get towards the West, they're taking away things like they're destroying fields of camas root, they're destroying just land in general, and just like putting up barbed wire fences was another way that just disrupted the natural order of things immensely across the board. Or taking out all the bison, which was a huge food source for a number of tribes. But again, just like you don't hear a lot about the Native American farming communities that have been out here for a long time because people have been farming in these regions for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we're still lucky that we have some of these kinds of things out around that we can celebrate today, So it's just really important. And the piece that really solidified taking away a lot of indigenous culture was really a war on knowledge. So there's a gentleman by the name of Richard Pratt who starts the boarding school systems, with the first one being in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he's known for saying, kill the Indian, save the man. So his thought process was to Americanize these young Native people. So they were literally pulling out Native children from their farms or from their families and bringing them out east, forbidding them to speak their native languages. So at this point in history, they're destroying thousands of generations of knowledge that had been handed down to family after family after family after family. And it comes to a screeching stop right here during this time period between the late 1800s. And some of these boarding schools were alive up until just recently in the past couple decades. They lasted a long time. And you see them pop up all over the nation. And even in where I'm from in South Dakota, there's just a high concentration of boarding schools around South Dakota and Minnesota. But it was so damaging for those generations to completely lose those values, those traditions, those cultures, and those pieces of what was once theirs. And it destroyed a lot of what was going forward. So for me, like growing up in post-colonial Native America, coming from a family that goes way back with the Lakota people in the Dakota areas, like this is what my cupboard looked like, except for the fresh fruits and vegetables in the front row of that picture. This is the commodity food program list, you know? And this is what a lot of families still survive off of today in many different reservations all across the country. And you don't look at this picture and be like, whoa, look at all that Lakota food, you know? But this is a reality that we face today. And the problem with these foods is that this was never meant to be a nutritional program. This program was meant to be a farm supplement program. So it started in the 30s to help farmers have some place to sell their supplies and their goods to the government. But of course, industrial agriculture happens later, and all those farms got bought up by large corporations. So this program doesn't even do what it set out to do in the beginning. And this was never a nutritional program because a lot of these preserved foods were just preserved with sugar and salt. So there's a ton of sodium, there's a lot of carbs. And the problem with this diet is, like, if this is all you have to survive off of, it's not going to do you very good in the long term. You're not going to live to be you know, really healthy in your older age, because the problem with this is it's a high glycemic diet. I mean, it's the sugar content and things. It's got a lot of sugar. So for indigenous peoples around the world, you know, they just do not pump out the insulin to maintain a high diet. Like Northern Europeans actually can do that. The Northern Europeans are the only ones that still produce the enzyme to break down lactose past the age of child rearing ages, you know. So most people in the world don't even are just completely lactose intolerant anyways. So to try to feed people who, like, just switch them immediately within a generation from what their traditional foods were to this kind of foods, and having to grow up with this, because I grew up eating, you know, powdered milk and government brand flakes a lot. And like I grew up way out in the country, so like our bus was this beat up old yellow Suburban that would pick us up on the dirt road every morning, and we'd get to school and we'd always be the last ones there. And we got there, they'd make us eat a quick breakfast because we had to. So it'd just usually be like a small box of cereal that we just rip open and pour powdered milk right into the box in the bag, and then eat that. And then we'd have to drink a juice, but since we were the last kids there, the only juice that was left was always the warm canned tomato juice. And then I still hate canned tomato juice immensely. And some of them are just bad. Like salmon, I had the hardest time loving salmon because all I knew was government canned salmon, which is really close to cat food. And it wasn't very fun. But sometimes we had to eat it, and it's just the way it was. And I was lucky because my grandparents had a ranch on Pine Ridge, so we had access to lots of fresh beef. We hunted a lot at a very young age. I got my first shotgun when I was like 7 years old. And you know, we hunted a lot. So we had some fresh proteins, but if this is all we were living off of, we wouldn't have done that well. And you know, this piece, there's just absolutely no reason that this one piece should represent all indigenous people across the board, you know? I mean, it tastes good. Like, I love fry bread. We grew up with it. But when you decolonize this plate, like, you lose the fry bread because flour and lard and salt and sugar, what the fry bread's made from, that's all government commodity foods. We didn't have that stuff before. You lose ground beef. You lose the weird California canned black olives. You lose the cheese. You lose the sour cream. Greens, beans, onions, tomatoes, those are fine. That's a healthy dish right there. But again, like, there's just absolutely no reason like why this should represent all of us. But the reason it did is because this was oppression food for us. Like, all we could make out of commodities like flour, lard, salt, and sugar was a simple dough, and without any ovens in most places too, like simply frying it up, which is very much a trick they had learned from a lot of cavalry and a lot of military type people and people out there, you know, surviving off of very just commodities basically like this. And again, like, I love it. It's just so funny that it should represent, because I always thought it was weird when I was growing up on Pine Ridge, and be like, it's weird that our native food tastes Mexican. Like, I just didn't get it, you know? So, but, you know, these are the problems, because when this is all the stuff we're eating, you know, almost all of our health care is because of what we're putting in our bodies physically. We're using our own hands to destroy ourselves with the food choices that we're making to put within our body. That's something that we can control if we wanted to. And it's just a part of it's a choice, though, because like, if all you have is commodity food to survive off of, that's what you got. We have recipes to make those foods taste good, and it's fine. But you know, indigenous communities before, they all worked together around their food systems. Everybody's job was food in one way or another. You're growing, you're harvesting, you're collecting, you're hunting, you're fishing, you're teaching your kids how to do all these various things, you're building tools to do all that kind of stuff. Everybody was doing something for the food because that's what we all had in common. So like a colonial mindset of like, what was important was vastly different from indigenous importances, you know, because colonial mindset was like, you know, they're pulling out those natural resources and they're utilizing people, they're putting settlers there, people who can get rich of, you know, cutting down timber or digging up mines and, you know, digging up different minerals for things. And for indigenous peoples around the world, they didn't care if they're sitting on a diamond mine. They didn't care if they're sitting on a gold mine, because what was important was the food, the environment, the health of the plants and the animals around them, their culture, their people. Those were things that were important. And the food that they did, like the food was something they celebrated, because food is part of our cultural identity. So it doesn't matter who you're from, where you're from, your ancestry. You think about the food of your parents and your great-grandparents and so forth, and that's a part of who you are. And to have a whole, you know, group of people completely, you know, stopping that situation is really damaging, you know. So for us, it's just trying to get us back, because I don't want to have to see statistics like this, you know, for future generations, for the kids and things like that. There's no reason that Native Americans have to have statistics like this where there's you know, high rates of type 2 diabetes. Some communities have like 60-70% type 2 diabetes, which is insane. And it's obviously the diet that's doing that damage out there. And that's something that we can fix, right? So for us, it was just trying to understand what our indigenous food system. So to think about what our indigenous foods, first off, just think about like how diverse our ecosystems are, how diverse the terroir is. Like there's many different regions, and this is a very generalized map, but there's all sorts of, like, you know, we've got mountains, we've got plains, we've got swamps, we've got ocean sides, we've got all sorts of stuff, and there's all sorts of different kinds of plants and animals that live in all these different regions and microregions and subregions and all that stuff. So there's a lot of diversity out there already. And then you just have to be aware that people are living in every single corner of this area, and people. So to think about what indigenous borders might look like, it's easier to look at a language map. Because if you look at a language map, you'll see like how much culture diversity we have there, and even within, again, a rather generalized map, within those big color blocks, there's still lots of subdialects and some other languages mixed in, and these are very fluid borders, you know, they move around a little bit. But it's a better way, because you can see like every 100 miles you're in a different language. So there's different belief systems, there's different spirituality, there's different foods, there's different flavors, there's different methods and techniques. And then, like, imagine if you're driving across the country stopping at indigenous restaurants along the way, and you would see that diversity if you're able to do that. And this is how we should be celebrating our regions, is because people have been living in these regions for thousands of generations, and they have this blueprint of how to do that using only plants and animals around them, and that's all they were able to utilize. And that's valuable knowledge, you know, compared to just being, you know, with the colonial mindset of just like you have to purchase your foods from somebody. Like food didn't cost anything back then. You know, people worked hard for it, was all. And like what happens if all the grocery stores and restaurants stop selling food? People wouldn't know what to do because nobody knows how to take care of themselves. But we should know how to take care of ourselves. So there's a lot of indigenous people still out there today. Canada still has 634 tribes. The US has 567. 231 are all up in Alaska. Mexico, almost a fifth of the whole population still speaks indigenous language, and there's a lot of indigenous food system alive down there today. So in Mexico, it's actually one of the best places to look at indigenous foods in North America, because if you strip away, it's way more indigenous than it is Spanish or French or anything else. So when you look at it, they still are utilizing things like nixtamalized corns, squash, chilies, tomatoes, all of these things that are very much, you know, had been there for a long time, well before Europeans showed up, right? So, and there's a lot of that food culture alive down there. You still find lots of indigenous groups who are still grinding things with stones, or still cooking things over fire. Everything's being done really indigenously, and it's really awesome to learn from Mexico. It's just history that makes one side of a border speak Spanish and one side speak English, because we all could have been speaking French for the same matter if history had just taken a slight different turn at one point. So it's just what you look at is the indigenous underlying of it, because Mexico is just as interesting and just as diverse down there when you look at their indigenous cultures. So when we're thinking about indigenous food systems, it's not just about culinary. So it's not just about, like, if you go to a culinary school right now and you're learning about French technique and knife skills and things like that, like those things are fine. There's a lot more to it the way that we looked at it. We understood that there was a whole bunch of pieces to really understand how it worked. Wild foods, permaculture, native agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, salt, sugar, fat production, indigenous crafting, cooking techniques, regional indigenous histories, indigenous traditional medicine, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality. There's a lot to understand to see how an indigenous food system works. So we just started doing that. And the one that really helped us out the most was reconnecting with the plants, because that's one commonality you're going to find in indigenous cultures all around the world, is that direct connection with the plants and the environment, knowing that you're a part of that balance, and being able to utilize everything you do with just mostly those plants around you. It's your food, it's your medicine, you can craft with it, you can build things with it, you can make clothing with it, you can make houses with it, you do all sorts of stuff with just the plant life that's around you. So for us, plant knowledge is power. It's what's helped us really, really define what we're doing and really define our regions differently. It's like, this is just walking around North Dakota plains for like an hour in the middle of summer, and there's just so much stuff. Most people might look at it and see, it's like, North Dakota is so boring, you know, because all you see is just this vastness. But when you stop and take a look, there's a lot of beautiful food out there. There's a lot of beautiful flavor everywhere. There's sours out there, like the sumac. There's all sorts of, you know, this understanding season. So like the spring vegetables these are spruce tips and ramp tips, and a lot of people know about this. But what's funny about this picture is those ramps with those tips, like if you pull the ramps up all the way from the ground, they're easy to find. They're going to be popping up out of the ground in like 2 weeks here, basically, right? So when you pull them all up, there's nothing left to grow. They can't reproduce, right? So like indigenous peoples knew that, and they were making sure that they were taking care of the plants. They were harvesting things carefully. There's even different songs and things that you sang and different offerings that people left when it was time to harvest something. So there was a lot of that deep connection with the plants that they were utilizing. So if you leave some of the bulbs in the ground, then those bulbs will split and create more plants. And you can take a lot of the tops. The tops are really flavorful because we just dry out a bunch of those tops, and they make wonderful dried onions for the rest of the year, you know, for our pantry. And the spruce tips are funny too, because I saw those in the Wedge in Minneapolis because they're coming in from the West Coast. And it's funny because it's like $30 a pound for some spruce tips, but then there's like a giant spruce tree right outside. And it's just like that disconnect, you know? We're just completely unaware sometimes of some of these really simple pieces. Or I never understood why people will go in sometimes and buy juniper berries for $45 a pound or whatever, an ounce or whatever they are. And then the whole parking lot's lined with juniper trees with just, you know, breaming with berries out there. And so it's just like being aware to your surroundings. And, you know, we should just have more education of what's out there. We don't need a word weed because Native peoples didn't need that. A weed just signifies something that we don't know, right? So we should know everything that's out there, and we should be teaching our kids that. And it's unfortunate that our kids can name more Kardashians than they can tree species, right? And that's our fault. We should be teaching them things that are important, like the names of the plants, which is something so simple, because when you start learning plants, you're going to see food everywhere outside your door, literally. Like it took Andrea probably 5 minutes to go find some cedar for the tea, right? Because it's all around us. And then understanding staples. Like for me, I grew up with Timsala because we harvested a lot of those. It's a wild prairie turnip. It grows all over the Great Plains. And it's really important. Or if you're in the Pacific Northwest, they had the camas, which was really important, staple. And people took care of these huge meadows of them. But then when cattle came around, they destroyed all those meadows because, you know, the cattle people were just like, wow, look at this beautiful valley our cattle can roam in, not knowing that people had been stewarding that land for thousands of generations, taking care of those plants in balance, and then having it destroyed in one season, which set off a bunch more wars, you know. So there's a war called the Bannock Wars you guys can read about that takes care of that stuff. Or even around Minnesota, Wisconsin, you know, our wild rice, which is so precious, and because it's the only place in the world that this stuff grows is in these regions, right? And we've destroyed so many of it. Who are we just talking to about, like, where's the wild rice? Right here, right? Because we've taken out so many of it because of industry, people clearing lakes so they can ride their jet skis around and keep them clear and stuff like that. If we just took the time to grow this food that likes to grow and wants to grow here, we'd have so much food, because people are still doing this in the traditional ways. They're not using any petroleum product to make this happen. People are building their own canoes. They're building the sticks. You know, one guy's pulling through the reeds. One guy's just taking 2 sticks and pulling the reeds over and knocking the grass seed into the boat. And it's beautiful, and there's so much food right there in that picture, and our lakes could look like that, and we could be harvesting and celebrating that food every year if we were smarter about our food systems. You know, so we've probably lost over half of the wild rice production that used to be out there within a very short 100 years in human history, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, right? Because it's something that's been making people happy around here for generations, and it's a big deal when harvest season comes for a lot of these foods. And it's just thinking about, you know, other water foods too. Like if you're on the coastlines, like seaweeds are really important because there's a lot of health and nutrition and things out there. And it's just taking the time to be aware again of all this stuff that's around us, because there's plants in our waters that we can utilize too. We just have to know the names and the properties of the plants. And the indigenous peoples and the cultures had that information before, before everything that happened. Or even in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you and maim you, if you know how to live with them, then they're beautiful and the foods are healthy and there's just food everywhere. Like almost everything has a purpose. Like, so when you're looking at plants, like all the plants have some kind of purpose. It's food, it's medicine. Again, you can craft with it. So it's just thinking that process. Like everything has a purpose except for ticks. That's the only thing without a purpose, but everything else does. But there's just a lot of beauty and just like being able to, work with these plants in a really beautiful way, because you're not going to like chainsaw that giant old saguaro down. Some of these plants are hundreds of years old, and a lot of respect and care goes into them. And again, lots of prayer and spirituality and connecting with them, So it's really important. And then we like to think about Native American agriculture because Native American agriculture starts hundreds or thousands of years ago, way down in south of Mexico, and it crawls all the way up this way, all the way into these regions, all the way into parts of Canada, all the way down throughout South America. So corn culture is just widespread, and it's amazing to think about that. It's a human feat to have this beautiful industrial thing happen where people are growing the same crops. So you're growing things like corns, beans, and squash, and a lot of people know about this Three Sisters garden situation where they put the corn and the beans grow up the stalks and the squash covers the outside to keep some of the plants out. But this is a more Eastern style farming situation, and it does come all the way out to this region. But like when people like Spanish were first showing up, when they're in Mexico City, and they're seeing things like, they called them the floating gardens, but there were these raised beds because they built the whole city on the lake, right? And this was a great farming technique because they were able to keep this really nutrient-rich soil by pulling these raised beds out of the water, and they're able to just turn that soil around, and they're just able to grow crop after crop in the exact same spot using that same soil, because that soil just keeps regenerating because of the water and the fish and everything in it, right? And they were able to like supply this entire huge and very clean civilization that was going on during that time period. Or this is a Zuni farm, which would be a kind of like northern New Mexico area, and they had a waffle system where they were able to, because they're in the middle of the desert, like nobody goes down to Albuquerque like, oh, I want to open up a farm here, But people had been doing that, and it's an awesome thing because people have been. And after hundreds of generations of like selective seeds and things like that, they're able to have these crops that were heat and water. They didn't need much water. They're drought resistant, and amazing that, they're able to do this for, again, like a few thousand years. And that's a huge feat to be able to have a farming system that lasts that long in the middle of the desert, with very, very simple tools. Where I grew up in the Dakotas, this is Buffalo Birdwoman. There's a book out there called Buffalo Birdwoman's Garden. And it's her perspective. She's a Hidatsa woman living on the Missouri River Valley. You can see the Missouri in the top part of that picture. And she's really close to where the whole Standing Rock thing was going down. But she talks about in this book how she grew up an indigenous Native American farmer and how all of that knowledge had been passed down through the female lines. It had been mother to daughter, grandmother, blah, blah, blah. So just down, again, thousands of generations of how to be a farmer. And she talks about how, before they saw Europeans, before they were utilizing metals or anything like that, she's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe, and she has like rakes that are made out of antlers. And she talks about the seeds, the corns, the beans, the squash, the same things you saw way down in Mexico, the same things you see out this way out on the East Coast. Like, there's the same crops, but there's so much diversity, and we're lucky to have any of that seed diversity left because a lot of these seeds were destroyed during that westward expansion period between the 1840s and 1870s. We lost a lot of this indigenous seed crop, so we're really lucky to have some of this crop. I mean, these corns have been around for a long time, and they're super important, So we should be celebrating some of these seeds and corns and these beans and squash and things because there's just so much beauty out there. And what we just have to realize how valuable this is, right? Because there used to be an immense amount of diversity in these crops out there before, and now we have a decent amount, but not like we used to 100 years ago, 120 years ago even. But corns, beans, so much beauty out there with all this stuff. Squash, and there's just so much, we are careful with these beings because they've been around a long time and they deserve a lot of respect too. I mean, we can do a lot of stuff with them. And so then it's just thinking about like some of these other processes around food. Like nixtamalization is really important. It's the process where you take corn and you turn it into hominy or pozole, whichever you might know it as. And it's something as simple as just cooking hominy in an alkaline bath, where people in the old school ways had done it with using just wood ash. Because whenever you cook anything down into just ash, all that's left is minerals. So when you throw this heavy ash into this water, it creates an alkaline bath, and then it helps like soften up and remove the outside of the corn and expands the kernel. But then doing this also makes it much more healthy and soluble for your body. So there's higher concentrations of calcium, potassium, magnesium, iron, zinc. And when Europeans first found corn, and they thought like, whoa, what a great crop, let's use this in some of these areas that we also took over. So they tried to like feed a bunch of people in Africa just corn product, not knowing about the nixtamalization, and they created a lot of disease and a lot of health problems over there because they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't take the time to learn from the indigenous peoples how to properly treat these kinds of pieces, because if you just eat corn, it's going to shoot right through you. But if you do this process, then it helps your body absorb it, and it becomes extremely nutrient rich for you. And it's really important. Or just the simple process of drying foods out. Can you imagine if one restaurant or one grocery store took the time to, instead of just wasting foods and throwing them away because there's some bruises on them and they can't sell them to the public, that they just dried them out? And like how much food product we would have from one grocery store doing that, like an immense amount of food. Because there's people like, we have a lot of people starving all across, and something as simple, we're so wasteful as who we are. We just see so much food waste, we don't even think about it. And we know about hunger, and we know about families that need food, and we're just throwing it away. So we can be so much smarter and resourceful with what we already have, and just like fix some of those things. It's not that hard. And I also love this picture because this woman, to cut up that squash in those perfect little circles is a really hard job, because our crew has like, these $500-600 Japanese knives, right? And there's no way that our crew could do that job that consistently. And she definitely does not have a $600 Japanese knife, in her pocket, because it's really. And then so all they're doing is just setting it up and letting it sun dry. And sometimes they'll put a little fire below, which adds a little bit of smoke to it too. And you still see things like that in the museums. This was at the Field Museum, and you could probably still eat that. That's really old, but you could probably still has some nutritional value from something as simple as just drying it out. And for us, like just being careful, like because we're using some of those special seeds and things like that. As a culinary group, we're taking the time to save those seeds and give those seeds back to the growers around us, so those seeds can go back in the ground. Because one squash is going to produce a whole bunch more. So it's something so easy just to keep that circle of life going. And just, thinking about other things, like I love this picture because she's drying out this berry harvest with this huge smoldering log. And can you imagine the flavor of like dried smoked berries? Like you can do all sorts of stuff like that in a culinary, context. So it's just really fun to think about the ways people were utilizing and saving foods. There's a Lakota woman making sausage out of wasna, which is dried bison pounded with usually choke cherries and some bison fat. And then they stuff the intestines and smoke and dry that. And it's just like some simple foods, We look at crafting medicines and all the other stuff for plants. You can make all sorts of cool dyes out of stuff. This is my friend in the Muckleshoot area in Washington, and she created this program where she teaches the kids all the plants around them and their traditional plants. And they go out and harvest them when they're coming into harvest season for whichever plant they might be. And then they process them in their community center, and they create a whole bunch of medicines like teas and salves and rubs and oils and lotions and things like that. And then they set up a huge medicine cabinet so anybody in their community can come and get free medicine anytime they want to. That takes care of most of the things that people have small ailments over, whether headaches, sore throats, upset stomachs, headache, whatever. Like a lot of this you can do with natural medicines that they've been utilizing for a long time. And the kids are getting to learn it, and the elders are getting to benefit from it. And it's such a beautiful program of, again, just utilizing plants around you, right? And it's fun to just look at how people are utilizing things for other things. So it's cool to make your own foraging baskets and stuff like that. So for us, it's just like taking all that knowledge and information and doing something with it. So we created a unique group, a small culinary group, but we're more than a culinary group because we're doing something. We became teachers too. We go and talk about this a lot, but we're outside. We've taught our crew to be able to be outdoors and to be a part of this, what we're doing, like just live it. So we're collecting things, like he's harvesting ramps. And we're utilizing technology because we have these wonder killers where we don't even have to think about anything barely, but we can use it as a tool for the greater good, right? So we're out there identifying plants, and it's just more and more. Every year we learn more and more plants we can utilize as we go around. And We get to go to other areas where we just learn their histories and their culture, and largely through the plants that they have there around them. Because when you start understanding and knowing the names of plants, you start seeing them for what they are, which is a lot of food and health and medicine. And taking the time to make our own pantries, like we don't have to follow, a Betty Crocker cookbook exactly to have that exact same spice mix in our pantry, because we can make our foods taste exactly like where we are. We're making all sorts of drying out corns and squash and mushrooms and maple sugar, and like there's all sorts of stuff that's right around us just to make food taste like where we are and make our own seasonings. And it's easy just to process some of these foods and just keep it really simple, and it's fun to do it in some of these old school ways because we don't need machinery to do everything. And then it's just re-identifying like what really truly is North American food. It's really by understanding our regions and understanding the deeper layer of history that lies there no matter where you are, and learning from the indigenous cultures who lived wherever you're standing for thousands of generations before you, because those are valuable knowledge. You don't have to be from an indigenous community just to appreciate a deeper knowledge of how to live on the landscape you grew up around here in North America. It's like making food taste like where you are. So rabbit, cedar, wild rice, cranberries, maple, you can find all those pieces walking around one lake, and it's really simple, and that's all you need, and that's all we're doing. And we're putting artistry in our plates, because anytime you have passion for anything, you can put artistry in the work that you do. So we enjoy making things look pretty, but the food themselves are really simple pieces. They're just really there for, we just like to showcase them for what they are and just the beauty of what they are. And making desserts with, since we're using only pre-colonial foods just to do it, just to showcase we can, we've cut out all dairy, all wheat flour, all processed sugar, no beef, no pork, no chicken. So we're just using the plants and animals just to showcase we've been doing it, because people had obviously done it long before we did it. We just wanted to figure out, we're just trying to take all those lessons. So we weren't trying to do a timepiece and cook like it was 1491. We were trying to just understand that knowledge and apply it to today to make us become something stronger and larger and bigger with it all. And it's fun because we're having a blast making all sorts of wonderful foods. And the cookbook is just a great resource. And our first food truck, when we did Tatanka Truck, and we knew that we weren't going to serve fry bread, so we really thought we were going to piss everybody off right away. But people were happy. Like, it worked out really well, and we did a lot of beautiful events. And we just sold the food truck to the White Earth Reservation last summer. So we're getting ready for the restaurants and stuff. But for us, it wasn't about us. It was about reconnecting with people, and it was about getting people to reconnect with their traditional foods. We're really doing it for those indigenous communities, So for our vision, like, we didn't want to just open up a restaurant, because then we'd literally lock ourselves in a box, and we wanted to help people all over the place, because people were coming to us from all over, like, we need this here, we need this here. And like, I know we see that, but we are just trying to figure out, like, how can we do that everywhere? So the way we did it is we created a nonprofit that we just released this year called North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, or NATIFS is the acronym. So NATIFS, we have two main goals, which is giving back the two things that were kind of fought when things were taken away from us. So bringing back indigenous knowledge, especially around foodways, and also creating food access. So getting food access back out to the people, getting the indigenous foods back out to the indigenous communities. Those are two main goals: it's education and food access. So we're doing this with a brand we created called the Indigenous Food Lab, which the first one will be opening up in Minneapolis. In the Indigenous Food Lab, it will have a not-for-profit restaurant, an Indigenous Foodways educational space, a classroom where we could teach about all those facets of indigenous food stuff. And we just want the restaurant we want to utilize to show people how to work in a restaurant utilizing these kinds of foods and give them that knowledge and education. So what we're doing is starting off in Minneapolis, teaching about all this education stuff, all this stuff we just talked about, creating curriculum and material, and becoming a resource for people to find this kind of indigenous curriculum and resources out there so people can utilize it in their own communities. And even things like the cookbook, which just has over 100 recipes using indigenous-only ingredients and showcasing how we did it, and just getting people to think about it. So for us, that book was really just kind of a gateway, like a 101 kind of a book of thinking about indigenous foods and how they can apply it to their own region and utilizing the philosophy. Because our second phase is opening up tribal restaurants with the tribes directly around us, helping them to develop their own food business for their community so they can cater to their community. They can grow community gardens. We'll give them the seeds and the knowledge and the resources to do that. We believe in permaculture design. We think these communities that suffer from food issues could just plant a lot of traditional foods all over town. You don't need lawns. Lawns are stupid. It's a waste of space, it's a waste of water, it's a waste of everything, you know, because you could put food all over that land space. You can put garden, you can put plants, you can put berries, you can put tree nuts, you can put all sorts of things all around your space. You don't need, you know, a 3-acre lawn that you have to maintain constantly for what, you know? We could be, again, being much better with our land and our resources of what we have directly around us. And even like a small lawn, we can do so much with a small space. Even in a town, in an urban setting, we could still grow a lot of food if we just took the time to do it. And that's how we're going to feed the world in the future, is getting communities to think about their own foods. And if you get a community to work together around food again, it's going to make them stronger. You know, because if you can control your food, then you can really control your destiny. And right now, we're not in control of our foods because we have to go out and buy our foods every single day. Like, unless you are completely self doing everything, then that's great. But not everybody's like that, you know. So we're just trying to showcase ways that, you know, learning from those lessons and doing it, because we see this being valuable everywhere, because our last phase of the nonprofit is to open up Indigenous food labs everywhere we can, and creating basically a model for anybody to utilize around the world, you know, because for us, it's breaking free from all this oppression that we've been living under for so long. And this is like Indigenous food evolution for us, because we're able to grow with it. And taking all that knowledge from the past and the strengths that we have today, it's becoming something bigger and stronger. Like, we have to evolve and we have to adapt, and we can do that. And this kind of work is giving us the chance to do that and to become something super awesome. And again, like, sharing this work so people can do it around the world. We can decolonize all those old trade routes if we want to, by utilizing this same mindset everywhere you go, around Africa, around India, around Southeast Asia, around Australia, around New Zealand. You see the same health issues, you see the same everything that happened because of colonization. And we can bring back just by utilizing the knowledge of the people that had been there, because those knowledges were valuable and it's really important. So we're doing this for the next generation. The best thing that I can do in my time is just build the framework for my next generations, for the people coming after me. It's just getting the foundation set for them, because those kids, they're the ones that are going to be able to, these are the ones that are going to be the next leaders. And I want them to grow up knowing exactly what their traditional foods are and why their foods are better than going to McDonald's, you know? This is really important. So it's just getting them to reconnect with the nature around them and training them and teaching them. This is our friend Maisie. She was only 11. We utilized her at the James Beard House in New York a few months ago. She's probably the youngest Indigenous woman to ever cook at that high establishment, you know? But we're giving them opportunities that they never would have had otherwise. And like, I shouldn't have had any opportunities growing up on Pine Ridge Reservation, because the statistics there are so awful. I'm only supposed to live to be like 56 or something like that as a male from Pine Ridge, right? So it's just breaking free from that kind of control. And what, you know, so what can we do? First off, it's just like being aware. Be aware of your histories, you know, be aware of the region, the land, be aware of the people that were here before, you know, go out, learn some of the languages around you. It's always here, like, you know, if you're going to be here in this country, you might as well learn the languages. Well, we should, right? So, because it's going to be deeper. Like, we should know the original names for all the plants. There's a lot more knowledge with those older names that are out there. They explain a lot more. And learning the plants around you is going to be important to help. It's going to be important for anybody. And just knowing why it's important to protect natural resources, our environments, because those are something that can give us health. They can define us of who we are. And it's just so short-sighted for large companies to want to strip away natural resources to make who rich, you know? Not us, not the normal people, right? So it's just understanding like why it's important to stand up to some of those battles and to do something about it. And to support Indigenous food producers, because that's been our whole model, is just trying to support. Celebrate seed diversity, save your seeds, share your seeds. Like, we can create so much food without any money if we don't have to. Like, we can do that. Just share with amongst ourselves. Like, it's just growing food. And trying not to appropriate completely, because like, we just want we want the Indigenous tribes to reclaim who they are and what they are, you know? And it's really important, because we don't want a Rick Bayless to, you know, show us what really is Native American foods. We want to do it ourselves, and we want to showcase people that we have to go through this evolution and knowledge process and regain a lot of this knowledge that was passed and taken from us, and rebuilding it. So it's just important for us, you know, and you can support us if you want to. I always like to throw that out there, one last little thing. But it's just like doing something, you know. So that's my talk. We're going to do a quick demonstration real quick. Everybody's going to get a little bit of sample. And then maybe what we can do while I'm doing this is take some questions, and I can talk while we're doing that. We don't really have a microphone, so I think we can shout out. It's pretty good acoustics in here. So, does anybody? I know that's like a lot of information. Is this on? Oh, that's fine. Okay. So we're just making some wild rice off of the out of the cookbook, basically, and we have some. This wild rice we've got from Minnesota, right?
Correct.
Yep. So it's just really simple, and it's just showcasing like a few flavors. You got that? We have some oil, sunflower oil. We have some shallots or some onion. We have some sage, and I'm just going to get this going. And Andrew, do you want to see if there's any questions on the crowd while I'm doing this? And we'll kind of do that. So if you guys have any questions, please just shout them out, because I know that was a ton of information in a very, very short time. But, you know, somebody's got to have a question out there. Yep, so I put in some oyster mushrooms and mixed mushrooms. Looks like there's some cremini. I put in some toasted hazelnut. I'm just trying to get this burner to get hot. Or maybe we're making a cold salad. Is it going?
Yeah, it's going.
Okay. All right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know you were talking about like when the lakes they have like TV and you can use that, but how do you do that when I'm still with like
Yeah, you have to be really careful with that, and a lot of the like cattails, like if there was a lot of cattails, they were pulling a lot of that and cycling it through. So it's like watching that water. It might take a few years to let a lake repair itself and heal. So, but there's a lot of plants out there that can do that job for you. But you know, we need to help it along too. But we need to be very aware. And there are some really great clean water sources around us. You know, there are some beautiful areas still that are, you know, really well done. But you know, we've ruined so many of them that we do have to look at how can we repair so we can start to grow food and plants back out into some of these areas that they should be. You know. So it's going to be a lot of work, but it's going to be necessary work. So I also threw in some cranberries, and it's just cooking up some mushrooms till they're a little soft and getting the onions so they're a little tender. And the sage helps a little bit. And then this is the salt, right? Yep. It's like a Hawaiian. So. And we're just going to basically, it's kind of almost like a stir fry. And this is, what is this one? This is the stock. Yep. You're going to put a little bit of stock in there. A little bit of pure maple. You want to use the pure maple, and you want to use the real wild rice, like the hand-harvested wild rice, because it's not like the black wild rice that you find in a rice-a-roni mix. Because this stuff is just unique, and you know you can see the color. I don't know if you can see it, but it doesn't look anything like, and it doesn't like that black wild rice was designed so it could be grown in large patties, and they can use machinery like combines and things to go through it and harvest it. Whereas this stuff is just out there on the lakes. Like this is the true wild rice, and the true wild rice has all sorts of beautiful colors. It ranges into yellows and reds and greens and browns and everything, and it just has this beautiful aroma, and it cooks so much faster, and it's just so much healthier. Because that black wild rice, I don't know what they do to it, but it's just, you know, it takes forever to cook, and it has a particular thing. But this is like our stuff because this comes from our regions out here. So this is what we should be celebrating and utilizing.
Elaborate on maybe specialty foods or something that maybe happens like to a birth or a way to pass it between a man and a woman or.
It just really depends because we have so much cultural diversity out there that it really changes from tribe to tribe. Even within tribes that, you know, even like within Lakota tribes or Dakota tribes or Ojibwe tribes, like each different region kind of has some of their own traditions that they follow. And a lot of it's designed with the plants and the things around them. So, but there are a lot of cultural and spiritual and traditional pieces out there. But again, it just changes so much. So it's just a matter of, going and talking and learning some of those pieces. Our focus is really the foods and the plants and the whole food system. So we're just trying to open up the doors for people to see that and see what they can use from it, because we want to get these traditional foods, especially back out into the tribes. We don't want to see all this unhealthy food all the time. And so if you go to a powwow, you're not going to see a lot of healthy food choices. You're going to see a lot of fry bread. You're going to see a lot of sodas and a lot of other things that we could do better. We could just do so much better. We could be serving healthy teas. We could be serving these wild rice bowls. We could do all sorts of stuff that just has a better story to tell and has a lot more health involved. Yeah.
What kind of stock was that you added? Was that corn?
Yep, corn stock. So, and all this was in the book. We just wanted to pick a recipe and showcase like how simple these foods are. And a lot of the recipes that we're doing are completely vegan, because since we're not putting dairy or eggs and everything, it just ends up being this really wonderful plant-based food. And it's just so simple, and it's just really super healthy. And it's hard to see, but it doesn't take much. It's just utilizing a few simple pieces and making food taste like where you are, because we have most of these ingredients right around us. Maybe with the exception of the black Hawaiian sea salt, but. Right, exactly. So, and where's the wild rice there? Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it used to be here because it used to be all over. The wild rice used to stretch all the way out towards New York, and it's pretty much completely gone out there. But people are trying to reseed in some spots here and there. And it's something that we can repair if we really wanted to take the time to start moving forward, which we kind of should. So it's just getting people to see the value in those kinds of things. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry? I love the lobster mushrooms a lot. I think those are pretty awesome. There's a lot. It's fun to go mushroom hunting. Mushroom hunting is a whole different world. It's way different than plants, and there's mushrooms that can make you sick. And sometimes it's just when you're learning about plants and poisonous things, especially with mushrooms, sometimes it's just a different kind of medicine. Sometimes if you know how to utilize it, it's just a really strong medicine. So if you know how to use it, which is why there used to be like medicine men and medicine women, because they knew how to utilize those properties. And if you didn't know what you're doing, you can hurt or kill somebody, right? So it's just understanding them at those levels too. And there's obviously plants that we should just not, ingest at all. But it's just having those knowledges. But you're going to find a lot more edible and a lot more food out there than you will poisonous plants out there. But it's just good to learn the plants for all those properties. Yes?
Like branching off of what you said before, I went to culinary school and we learned nothing. And order Oneida, and we never learned anything about this. So I'm very excited for the food lab. Along with that, is there a chance that you're going to be doing like informing and doing like foraging sessions?
Yeah, because we're going to be teaching about all those parts. We're going to work with some of the local indigenous farms, because we work with like Wajupi, which is the Midwakaton organic farm down in the Shakopee area around Minneapolis. We work with another one called Dream Wild Health, which is north of us in Hugo, Minnesota. They're also a native-run nonprofit farm, and they grow out a bunch of cool stuff. So we have these partners that we can work with, and just taking people out to understand plants and foraging and seasonality. And we just want to be a place where there's a lot of classroom structure to offer that. But then we want to open up those indigenous food labs in larger areas all over the place, so they can directly impact especially the tribal communities around them. But they can impact, anybody can take these values and utilize it in any small town. It's just rethinking where our foods come from and what we can do about that. So, yes, sir.
How much of finding these foods or refining them can you get from stuff that survives in the community, and how much is just simple trial and error on your part?
As far as the wild foods or like domesticated? The wild foods? The wild food knowledge, I think, is already out there, because there's been a lot of people. I mean, Wisconsin, we have Samuel Thayer, who is amazing with wild foods and a great resource for those kinds of things. There's already a lot of study. There's a lot of study in ethnobotany and how people were utilizing things. There's a lot of introduced plants that weren't here 150 years, 200 years ago, But then again, it's just like taking again, we're not trying to like cut out a plant just because it wasn't here and it wasn't necessarily a traditional part of the diet, because we look at it with an indigenous perspective. Is it food? Is it medicine? Like, what can you do with it? because we're not going to dismiss dandelions, just because they're invasive and things like that, because we can eat them. So, but I think the wild food is kind of an easier one, even though it seems daunting at first, but there's been a lot of study in botany all around us already. The harder part for us was really the agricultural side and finding a lot of those old seeds that are still out there. So like I'm on the board with Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, and I also work on the board with Dream Wild Health, which is a native nonprofit farm. And there's groups like the Indigenous Seed Keepers Alliance, and there's just a lot of these people across the country trying to find and revitalize and restore some of these seeds, because some of these communities have been able to maintain their traditional seeds, like the Oneida white corn, So some of these seeds have been around and are still an important part of the communities, and some of them have almost died out. Like we were just using this Mohican red bread corn that went all the way down to 1 cob 2 years ago, and they were able to save it, and now they grew out bushels of it this last year. So it's just being aware of the value of some of those things that are out there. But plants is a great one to study in general, and it's just finding the importance of it. So, yes, sir. We cook so seasonally. Like personally, I always love chokecherry because I grew up with it. So it's just the smell and that aroma that kind of is a food memory for me that kind of zaps me backwards. So I love chokecherry, but there's all sorts of foods. We get excited especially like I get to travel around to different areas all the time. We get to be outside a lot and just finding stuff that's out there and utilizing these cool flavors. It's exciting when you find a big field of something and you want to play with it. So it's all the foods are cool, really. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I would connect with your local gardener group to access that.
Yeah. And there's a lot around the cities too, so you can always just reach out, and we're happy to point people in the right direction. I think it's just really celebrating some of the indigenous efforts that are out there around their food systems, because it's still up and coming, right? I mean, we can't just demand it to happen because it's going to take some time. Like a lot of people who grew up in an indigenous community just went through a lot of historical trauma, whether they realize it or not. So it's going to be really important for us to take the steps for people to start to bring those foods back into their communities. And for us, if we can see our vision of helping to create and impact those communities by putting a food business directly in their region designed to be specifically for their foods and their tradition and their culture, it's just a part of it. So it's just supporting efforts like ours, and there's other grassroots kind of movements out there and other indigenous chefs out there. And even in our cookbook, we included a bunch of other indigenous chefs from around the country just to help showcase some of that diversity and to showcase that it's not about me. Like I'm not trying to do this to become a celebrity chef or anything. It's really about just the knowledge and the wisdom and the philosophy around it of how it can enrich in all of us. Okay. Yes, ma'am. School gardens? Here and there. So we do get a lot of asks, and we're really happy to have the cookbook out right now. But it just really depends on our capacity, and we're just trying to become a resource and a network for people to be able to connect to the areas that they're looking for. So we're doing our best, and we're just getting ready to level up and grow. And the nonprofit, we're going to be able to bring in a lot more people to our organization to help us with our efforts. Bring in a lot of educators to teach about passions, whether it's native agriculture, or ethnobotany and wild foods, or cooking, history, whatever it might be, nutrition, health. So there's a lot of facets out there. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry? The Mitzitam Cafe? Yep. Yep. So yeah, I've been there. My friend Chef Freddie Bitsoe is the chef there. So it was great that they actually hired a native chef to to run the Native American restaurant there. So he's been working with a lot of plans. That's a really busy restaurant, though. They get a lot of traffic in there. So, anybody else? All right, well, should we wrap up and head over to, so we still have a few copies of the books left. We're going to sell whatever might be left there. Thank you guys for coming and listening.
All right, not to cut off the applause. Just a housekeeping, we do have some of the wild rice, which is cooked here today, available out in the lobby just where you found your tea today.